Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, listening, watching, participating in this telephone workshop. The focus is the big book, and the focus is applying the steps to our personal life. We begin with a prayer to have an open mind and an open heart. Please join me to have the Spirit enter in and set aside our prior knowledge and experience. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path in you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Today is June 26th, and we're taking a look at step one. We've begun formally looking at step one. It has two major parts. The first half of the first step about addiction, and the second half of the first step about the spiritual malady. The first half of the first step has two divisions, at least the way I understand and have experienced it. A problem with the body, as really articulated very well by Dr. Silkworth, an allergy that produces a phenomenon of craving. That's a metaphor. It's not science from his standpoint. He's a medical doctor and a psychiatrist. So he's speculating that it looks like, it feels like, it acts like some type of an allergy. And the outcome, the manifestation of the allergy, is that repetitive behavior over which I have no control. And then Bill speculates on page 24, and we've taken a look at it. So just stop it, then. You're bright, you're educated, you don't like suffering, no human being does. So just stop what is in fact creating your suffering. Well, of course, we have tried to stop. And we have stopped. We've been very successful for a day or two, or a week or two, or a month or two, or a year or two. This is the death dance of addiction, unfortunately, for some people. Not my experience. But I've seen it enough. I've witnessed it enough. I've heard about it enough. Relapse. And what's the issue here? Well, it's an issue of the mind, Bill says. On page 24 of the big book, he begins his description of the problem of the mind, and he uses 23 actually. And he uses a couple words that I've asked you to look at, obsession and delusion. Those are the key words. In the same way that the key word for the body problem was allergy and craving. To really give you, I hope, an understanding and an experience what powerless means in the body. It's a biochemical reaction over which you have no control. Similarly, this is a mental problem, literally mental, not psychiatric, not psychology. No, it's a thinking problem. We're vulnerable. Addicts of any kind are vulnerable mentally in a very strange way. We do not learn from negative consequences. Normal people do, trust me. You may not know any normal people, but normal people learn from their negative experiences once, twice, three times at a maximum, and they will change their behavior. Not addicts. They're going to try variations on a theme, and the obsession, the thought, is always there. This time it will be different. This time, in fact, it will even be better. A heightened delusion. An obsession is a thought that dominates our mind in such a way it's the only thought. And because it's the only thought, we don't know it's the only thought because it is the only thought. It's the only picture on the screen, so we don't see anything else. And the problem with the thought, it's a lie. The content of the thought is a delusion. As we discussed last time, an illusion is a misrepresentation of something outside of us through our own senses. An illusion, like a mirage. But a delusion is a misrepresentation of reality inside of ourselves. It'll be different this time. It has never been different in the sense of better. It's always been different in the sense of negative, but we don't remember the negative. We're just hoping for and have a fantasy about difference in a positive. And so the key question that you ask yourself, and hopefully you'll have enough skill in asking yourself and having an experience with it that you'll be able to, in a spontaneous and creative way, ask the people that you are trying to help. What were you conscious of 1 or 2 minutes just before you relapsed? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? What were you aware of? In your head, in your heart, in your gut. There's a variety of answers, but it's the question. It's the only question. If you've had a period of 24 to 48 hours of abstinence, that's success. What is it that happens when you pick up and ingest? Our mind is susceptible and vulnerable to the obsession. And once the obsession takes a hold of us, we won't know it. An obsession isn't a thought that we're conscious of. That's the real issue. Or if we're conscious of it, we're not very conscious of it. In fact, not effectively conscious of it. That's how Bill ends this whole series of conversations on the mind. At the page 43, he says, there'll come a time when we'll have no effective mental defense. This is not poetry. This is Bill's experience. He's trying to craft words based on his experience so that we can identify our own experience and get the knowledge, but translate it based on our own history and our own experience so that we re-experience this sense of powerlessness. I don't have the power of thought if it's an obsession. If it's just a thought, well, of course, then you can pray. If it's just a thought, you can call a sponsor. If it's just a thought, you can go to a meeting. If it's just a thought, you can help somebody else. Because it's just a thought. And you have some power over your thinking, of course. You're a rational human being by definition. But as an addict, there's a special kind of thought over which you have no control. And that's the obsession. So let's take a look at page 24. Bill talks about the fact is that most alcoholics, most addicts, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week ago, a month ago, or yesterday. After being in jail overnight, I sat at my living room table having a scotch, thinking about what happened. I mean, there was no connection. Oh, I was tired. Oh, the cop made a mistake. Oh, this is all not my fault. I could not see the truth. We are without defense against the first drink. There is a complete failure of the kind of defense that keeps one from putting his hand on a hot stove. If you ever put your hand on a hot stove in a place that you were not familiar with, you would never walk into that room again and not know where the stove is. And yet you're on this call because you have a repetitive history of suffering from your behavior, repeating this madness. Sometimes without any thought, sometimes with a little thought, but never with any thought that's effective. This is pernicious, subversive, all kinds of words. It still boggles my mind. I didn't have this awareness and this experience with this particular piece of the first step until I was 7 years sober, the second time I went through the steps. And I spent 48 hours in a state of abject fear, total, overwhelming fear. I couldn't even go to work the next day because I knew 7 years sober that there was nothing I could do to stop me from taking a drink. Nothing. 7 years sober, having had a spiritual experience in 1988, 3 years earlier. In 1991, there was a complete experience and awareness that there was nothing I could do from stopping the guillotine from falling. I was petrified because I really, really saw it from my own history, not just from the big book. The big book helped me unpack it, but from my own history. I could see a whole series of events that were ridiculous, by Bill's terms, insane. It comes from the Latin word sanus, S-A-N-U-S, which means health. And when you put an I-N in front of it, it just means unhealthy. We'll see that in Jim's story here in a little bit. I hope to get to it today. He says, what sort of thinking when we're beyond human aid? These are facts. There's lots of material on pages 25 through 33 that we will cover when we talk to each of you. And that you could hear me unpack on my recordings on my website. But I really do want us to take a look at Jim's story. Bill starts chapter 3 more about alcoholism with a very precise approach to step 1, much more precise than the step 1 in the list of steps on page 59. He says, on page 30, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost self that we were alcoholics. This is the first step. Now, I'm surprised he didn't put it in italics. Maybe he didn't want to conflict with the list of steps on page 59. But this is a much more aggressive definition of the first step than the actual first step in the list of steps. Fully concede to our innermost self that we were addicts. This is the first step. He says the delusion that we are like other people, or presently maybe, has to be smashed. The delusion that we are normal has to be smashed. The delusion that we will ever be normal has to be smashed. Most of us have had pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization and have experienced a progressive illness. He uses the metaphor of losing your legs. Nobody on this call is normal. Nobody on this call will ever be normal. That's not our goal. Our goal is to have such an effective relationship with power that we have a spiritual shield that protects us from our own insanity, meaning our own unhealthy thinking, meaning the vulnerability to the obsession and the delusion. That's what he means by it. There is no such thing as making a normal drinker out of an alcoholic, page 31. He makes a couple observations there about testing whether you're an addict or not. And he says, try some controlled drinking. And of course, that's a very unhealthy recommendation. It's not a recommendation. It's like saying, if you really have some doubt, try to control it. Well, the problem with that is the allergy. If you are an alcoholic, you won't be able to control it, and you don't know what will happen. You could drive and go to jail. You could drive and kill yourself. You could drive and kill somebody else. You really don't know. You can't predict if you're really an addict or an alcoholic. So that's not a recommendation I have ever made. 3 pages later, he says, try some control by not using alcohol for a year. Try to eliminate whatever it is your addiction. Try to eliminate it for a year. He says most real addicts won't be able to do that. And probably you have that experience. On page 35, he talks about, we're going to describe some of the mental states that precede a relapse into drinking, for that's the crux of the problem. That's how I opened up this conference. What were you thinking, feeling, aware of, conscious of, 1 or 2 minutes just before you relapse? That's the key. Not the story about what happens afterwards, not the story that built up to the relapse. That's all just story. And some of it may even actually be true, but it's just not relevant. The only relevant question is, what were you thinking, feeling, consciousness, aware of just before 1 or 2 minutes you engaged in the addiction? What sort of thinking dominates an addict who repeats time after time the desperate experiment of the first drink? Why does he? Of what is he thinking? I hope you're getting the practical application of this suggestion. And that's why the worksheet on the mind is so important. Not a test. There's no correct answers. There's just your answers. It's a prompter to help you rewalk the path of your history of addiction so that you can actually see what you used, when you used it, what were the ingredients, what were the thoughts, what were the feelings, what were the consequences, and do that in a bullet point review of your history in that worksheet. At some point, using it as a prompter, not only just to remember, but to re-experience the hopelessness and the helplessness, or maybe to experience for the very first time as you perhaps write it out and then maybe read it out to a sponsor or a good friend or a companion or a step guide. Reading it out loud was what cracked me open to the possibility that I had a problem. Writing it began to give me the hint back in February of 1984. But reading it out loud left no doubt at all that I had a problem with alcohol. And it was the very first time. And so here's Jim. Unpacking the story, we see that he did no drinking until he was 35, and he's the son of a man who started a car automobile agency. Now, this is written in 1939, so Bill is talking about somebody who established an automobile agency in the 20s, because this is the son of that person. Obviously very successful, very entrepreneurial. Cars had just been created by Ford, I believe, in the early 1900s. And he's 35 years old before he ever takes a drink. He's got a wife and a company and a success and children, and it's just an attractive personality, it says. but he has a nervous disposition. It says every time he drinks, he goes to the insane asylum now. I mean, he's a real bad case. He fell really hard. It wasn't very progressive with him. When he drinks, he goes to the insane asylum because they didn't have detox centers. They didn't have hospitals and treatment centers. They just put you in the booby hatch is what they called it. Now, here's the key to the story on page 35, from my standpoint. On leaving the asylum, he came into contact with us. Okay, so here's Bill and Bob, perhaps. There's no historical documentation of that, but it's Bill's writing here. He's remembering, so maybe when he is stuck in Akron there for the 3 months in 1935, he and Bob were trying to figure out how this thing worked, and they went to the jails, and they went to the hospitals, and they went to the insane asylums in order to find people to work with. It says, on leaving the asylum, he came into contact with us. Us. Perhaps Bill and Bob. It makes for a better story. We told him what we knew of alcoholism. Unpack that. What did Bill and Bob know? Well, from Dr. Silkworth, they knew that they had a body problem and a mind problem. A body problem like an allergy, a phenomenon of craving over which they had no control, and a mind problem, which Bill had really experienced and articulated in this section, where we have an obsession and a delusion over which we have no control. So that's what they explained to him, that you're powerless. He made a beginning. We told him what we knew of alcoholism and the answer we had found. So this guy's in an insane asylum. He says, I understand what you're saying. I identify with what you're saying. Yes, I'm an alcoholic. So they told him about God, steps 2 and 3 by our translation. In the Oxford group, they had only one step about that. So they brought him right to it once he admitted. Now, that's in contrast to Fred, and we'll look at Fred later on. See, Fred didn't say he had a problem. This was his first experience. He was in the hospital. Even the doctor wouldn't tell him. And so he says, well, I understand what you're saying, but I don't have a problem. So they never told him about step 2. We'll unpack Fred's story next time. It's quite different than Jim's story. It's quite different than their experience with Jim. Jim rolled over. He said, yes, I'm absolutely powerless. I go to the insane asylum. I am one of you. So they told him about step 2 and 3, God, and step 4, inventory, and they took his 5th step, confession, and they put him on the road to doing his amends, and look at what happens. His family is reassembled. He begins to work as a salesman, all right? All went well for a time. He was experiencing the promises because he had started making his amends. He got free from the alcohol. He restored his entire life. He is so grateful. But ominously, it says here, he failed to enlarge his spiritual life. On the face of it, what do you think that means? Well, I thought, well, he wasn't praying and meditating. Some other people speculated, well, he wasn't going back to church because he had been a Christian. All right. And interesting speculations, but Bill actually answers the question, not from material that you've already looked at, but you will when we get to step 2, but on page 14. And if you have your book, take a look at it. And if you don't have your book, make a note. At the very bottom of page 14, the very last line, for if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, Bill gives us the definition of enlarging your spiritual life. Not here in Jim's story, but in another place in the book. And that's where I really am confirmed that the big book has such internal integrity. What it says in one place, it says in another place. What it says in one place, it defines and expands on in another place. That's why knowledge of the big book and multiple readings of it thoughtfully are so helpful because we begin to piece it together like Bill had seen it and was writing from his own personal knowledge and experience. He failed to enlarge his spiritual life. So what? He got his family back. He got his job back. Things are going really well. And he forgets sixth step of the Oxford group. Roland Hazard reached out to Ebby Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher reached out to Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson reached out to Bob Smith. And now Bill and Bob are reaching out to anybody who will listen to them. And they all stayed sober. Well, for a while, Ebby didn't on a long-term basis, but Ebby was a sober the last 2 years before he died, just as a footnote. So Jim here failed to enlarge his spiritual life. He wasn't carrying the message. He wasn't trying to help anybody else. He returned back to his self-centered life. Well, what happens? He found himself drunk a half a dozen times in rapid succession. But listen to this in terms of modeling sponsorship. Each of these 6 occasions, we worked with him. They didn't throw him away when he relapsed. They said, come back and talk to us. What happened? Let's review it. Let's try again. Reviewing carefully what had happened, he agreed he was a real alcoholic in a serious condition. He knew he faced another trip to the asylum. Moreover, he would lose his family, he would lose his job, and eventually he would lose his life and go back to the insane asylum. And he knew all of that. And on page 36, with all that knowledge, he drank again. Well, we can really relate to that if you have any type of experience with relapse. You know better, you just can't do better. It's kind of a mystery, and yet it's our history. I didn't mean to be a poet, but so he says we want to know specifically what happened. So he unpacks it on Tuesday morning. He goes to work. Joe and Darlie have a little tongue-in-cheek humor here and says, well, where was he on Monday? Cute. But it also indicates he felt irritated because he has a resentment. He doesn't own the business anymore. He lost it. And he works for a guy who now owns it. And he's irritated. But he got over it and he went out to try to sell a car. He'd done it many times. And he gets hungry at lunch. And he stopped at a cafe that he's been at many times. He got a sandwich and milk regularly there. He was an old customer. Small town kind of guy. And this time, however, it says in italics, the thought crossed my mind, here's the obsession, that if I were to put an ounce of whiskey in my milk, it couldn't hurt me on a full stomach. Now, that makes absolutely no sense to anybody. Who mixes whiskey with milk? And yet, it seemed like a reasonable thing at noon to a guy who has a history of going to the insane asylum. I ordered it. I vaguely sensed, see, he had a little premeditation, a little awareness, but not much. And in fact, not enough to be effective. I was not being too smart, but the experiment went so well, I ordered more, and I started my journey back to the insane asylum again. At the very bottom, it says, he had much knowledge about himself as an alcoholic, yet all reasons for not drinking were easily pushed aside in favor of the foolish idea that he could take whiskey if only he mixed it with milk. There's the key. He says, Bill, on page 37, if you ever want to have some fun in a meeting, talk about insanity, and quote page 37. It's very clear in the big book what insanity means. He says, this is a lack of proportion, a lack of the ability to think straight. Sanus, unhealthy thinking, a lack of proportion, an inability to think straight. That's all it means. It doesn't mean psychiatric. Now, that's important here in step 1, but it's more important in step 2, because in fact, step 2 formally says we're restored to sanity. They're not talking about psychological and psychiatric. They're talking about the invulnerability to the obsession, common sense, a sense of thinking straight, healthy thinking, a sense of proportion. That's what they mean by insanity and sanity in the big book. But staying with the insanity says, well, what kind of thinking? Every single one of us have experienced this curious mental phenomena, insanely trivial excuse, the sound reasoning failed, the insane idea won. Sometimes we justify it because we're really good at rationalization, which is just protecting ourselves with a lie, not realizing it's a lie. It's an unconscious reaction. Unhealthy coping mechanism, one of several ego defense mechanisms. Feeling ourselves justified by nervousness, anger, worry, depression, jealousy, or the like. But we're obliged to admit that our justification for esprit was insanely insufficient in light of what always happened. In light of what always happened, it's never different in the best or better sense. It's always different in the negative sense, but we think about the difference. We don't think about the negativity. What's wrong with us? We have a twist. We have a mental defect. It's never going to be fixed. All you can be is protected from it. There's the key. For steps 10, 11, and 12, we're not cured. We're vulnerable to the obsession if we don't have a spiritual shield. Well, this is the meaning of the material in the big book. You may or may not agree with the vocabulary or with the concepts from a spiritual standpoint. And someday they may explain it from just a psychological standpoint. But right now we're unpacking the big book and the approach to understanding what Bill's assumptions were, both biologically, psychologically, sociologically, but mostly theologically spiritual in terms of human development. We have to admit that our justification for esprit was insanely insufficient in light of what always happened. There was little serious or effective thought during the period of premeditation of what the terrific consequences might be. Now, I've had people say, no, I knew exactly what the consequences might be. I knew exactly that there would be insane behavior. I knew exactly that I might go to jail, that I might do, and I did it anyway. They're trying to argue with me about insanity. And I go, is that sane thinking? That you knew there's going to be a catastrophe and you did it anyway? And then they look at me and kind of like, oh gosh, I guess not. So either you don't have the consciousness or you have the consciousness at some level and you do it anyway. See, that's powerlessness. That's no choice. That's unhealthy thinking. Animals protect themselves in survival. They avoid suffering. The human animal is really good at normally avoiding suffering. But the addict animal, the addict human, somehow forgets to remember or overrides the memory to somewhat romanticize it, that I am different, it is different, circumstances are different, and it's never true, but we believe it. or we don't think about it at all, and that will be Fred's story when we come to it next week. The conclusion with prayer, please, the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.